Thank you for that. Two readings today that I want to lift up. First, here's a story from the 15th chapter of Matthew, beginning at the 21st verse. Hear this word. Jesus left that place and went to the district of Tyre and Sidon. Just then, a Canaanite woman from that region came out and started shouting, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon." But he did not answer her at all. And his disciples came and urged him, saying, "Send her away, for she keeps shouting after us." He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and knelt before him, saying, "Lord, help me." He answered, "It is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." She said, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus answered her, "Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish." And her daughter was healed instantly. And then turning over, just a short segment from John's Gospel, hear this word. The next day, Jesus decided to go to Galilee. He found Philip and said to him, "Follow me." Now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. And Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him about whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus, son of Joseph from Nazareth." Nathanael said to him, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" And Philip said to him, "Come and see." When Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him, he said of Nathanael, "Here truly is an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." Nathanael asked him, "Where did you get to know me?" And Jesus answered, "I saw you under the fig tree before Philip called you." Nathanael replied, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Jesus answered, "Do you believe because I told you that I saw you under the fig tree? Truly I say, you'll see greater things than these." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let us pray. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Many of you will remember the name Philip Gulley. Philip Gulley is a writer and Quaker pastor who visited here a couple of years back, maybe not quite 2 years ago. He preached from this pulpit right where I'm standing now, and he led a conversation with us one evening, kind of centered on some of the things he had written. I came across a piece Gulley wrote not long ago about an experience that he had traveling out east not long ago to a conference of church leaders to give a keynote address. It was before a gathering of clergy, a lot of people there, and Gulley, in this little piece that he wrote, said the reason he was invited, according to his hosts, was because the church in that region wasn't doing all that well. It wasn't thriving, not attracting many new folks, and certainly not attracting younger folks. And they hoped Gulley, who has this kind of great knack of weaving together stories from life with the gospel, they thought Gulley might give them some pointers. He'd been effective in his little Quaker meeting house down near Indianapolis, and they thought maybe Gulley would be the guy who could kind of wake them up and make them a little more with it and relevant. So they invite him to come as the keynote talk. And the story is, according to Gulley, when he got there, just as he was being introduced, he's down in the front row, and one of the judicatory officials is up in the podium giving the introduction of his credentials and whatnot. He's getting ready to go. He's got his notes in hand for his speech. Just as the introduction's going on, another denominational executive leaned over and said, "Pastor Gulley, you do know, don't you, that the bishop has made it clear you're not to say anything that could be construed as controversial or upsetting to the clergy who are here today?" And Gulley said, "Well, I was kind of taken aback by that." And I asked him genuinely, "Well, what do you consider upsetting?" I thought you invited me here to talk to these folks about being more alive and relevant and thoughtful. I mean, somebody might get upset in the process. I don't know. According to Gully, the answer came back from the official, well, we did invite you to wake us up and help us be relevant, but we want you to help us be relevant in a way that doesn't upset anybody. And Gully said, I knew what was in my notes. I knew what the first opening point was going to be, and my heart sank. You know, I was about to tell them, just moments away from saying, the only way forward for we who are in the church is we got to get over the notion that our chief duty is perpetuating the bureaucracy and the institution and get on with reaching people. You know, get out there and quit worrying about why don't people come to us, but get out there and go to them. That's what I was going to say. And I was just about to then follow that up with the statement that when the maintenance of the institution becomes our main objective, rather than seeking the living God, we send signals that drive away people, especially people who are thoughtful and who have questions and who have doubts. And we create an environment that's more suitable to, you know, maintaining a museum than a community of human growth and where life takes place. That's what I was going to say. And I knew right then I was in for a long afternoon. I smiled when I read it, and apparently he got out of there alive and well, but that little piece drew me to this whole idea of healthy faith being a faith that tolerates honest questions more than it expects people to have this kind of feigned certainty that when it comes to the deep things of God, we know all that we need to know. I think Jesus consistently practiced a respect and taught that spiritual health does involve an openness to people who are searching, who have honest doubts, honest questions about where God is found. And I think very much like Phil Gully modeled for us and continues to model out there, Jesus was one of those people who operated under the assumption that there can be no growth in our relationship with God without the support of a community that encourages people to ask and to doubt and to have places of value on searching and enlightenment, and much more than it does value the preservation of the institution or the status quo or the doctrines. Our allegiance is more to human connection to God than the doctrinal structure of the past. And just to give some evidence of how Jesus seemed to approach that, these two gospel stories came to mind. I think they're both wonderful illustrations of the kind of high level of tolerance Jesus demonstrated with people who could be honest about who they were, both in their strengths and in their doubts, and who would have been kind of considered suspect by the spiritual conventions of the day. The first one I just would quickly highlight is that little section from John, just the offhand comment Jesus makes there when he meets Nathanael. You know, sometimes you can learn a lot about people by just the offhand remarks that they make, as much as you can learn from their formal remarks. What they say just casually sometimes makes the most difference. Therapists will tell you that all the time. You know, they notice if somebody comes late for their therapy session and they sit at the far edge of the room and they kind of are oriented toward the door, you know, the message is being sent. I'm not so eager to be here. You can kind of pick up before anything is said just on the casual posture of people. So it is in the gospel. Sometimes you can pick up a lot from the casual responses folks make. And in this passage, if you notice, you know, it's early in John. The disciples are in the process of being recruited. And one who's been recruited is Philip, who is very excited about discovering who Jesus is and feeling called to be included in the 12. And the first thing Philip does is he runs to Nathanael, his friend, and tells him the good news. Nathanael, we have found the Christ, Jesus of Nazareth. And Nathanael, not sold on this at all, and Nathanael kind of reflecting the prejudices of his day, the prejudice being that Nazareth was a backwater community where uneducated kind of country bumpkins lived. Nathanael, reflecting that prejudice, honestly says, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" right? And interestingly enough, Jesus hears that. He overhears it. Jesus the Nazarene doesn't get mad, but instead kind of smiles and says, "Behold, here's a man in whom there is no guile." Isn't that a nice response? He's not ticked off about this at all. Rather than see Nathanael as a critic, or he welcomes his straightforward, "Here, this is what I think." You know, he welcomes that. And what a delightful change, in fact, Nathanael would have seemed to him compared to some of the religious leaders he met. You know, the scribes and Pharisees, they were always saying one thing while meaning another. You know, they would try to trick him with these, you know, if a woman has 7 husbands and they die one after the other in heaven, whose will she be? And then they are getting ready to make their notes as to whether he makes a response that violates the code of the day. They were always saying one thing, but kind of had a smuggled in hidden agenda underneath the words. And not Nathanael, you know, no leader could come from, you know, Bumpkinville, Nazareth. And Jesus says, "Behold, here's a man in whom there is no guile." It just kind of gives the first initial hint that for Jesus, you know, people's honesty was not something to look down on, but something to support and encourage. And he's welcomed then. Nathanael eventually is, into the presence. But that's carried on. I think this same posture is carried on to a much greater degree in the longer story that I read from Matthew, which in some ways is a beautiful story and in some ways a troubling story. Jesus and his disciples, as you heard in that Matthew 15, they are going through the region of Tyre and Sidon and walking along together, and suddenly this woman comes out of the crowd, which would be unusual for a woman to approach a group of men and stop them and interrupt what they're doing with a demand. "Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is tormented by a demon." Now, most New Testament scholars believe that when the New Testament describes somebody as being tormented by a demon, what it probably meant in our modern way of thinking is that they had a condition that led them to have like uncontrollable fits of some sort, maybe like epilepsy or some seizure disorder, or maybe they had some mental illness that made them kind of uncontrollable at times. And so with the mindset of the first century, they believed that when they were in these uncontrollable states, that's when they were possessed by a demon. And so, lo and behold, this woman has a daughter, probably with one of those conditions. And if you can imagine, you know, if you were a parent of somebody, the first century, no medications, having seizures, or somebody who had a daughter who was mentally ill, you can imagine how desperate the need for help would be. "Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is tormented by a demon." She's bold enough to get up there and block the entourage on the road as they went away. And given the cultural predisposition at the time, the disciples are put off by this forwardness. "Send her away," they say to Jesus, "for she keeps shouting after us." But instead of doing that, which is what they wanted him to do and what you might expect a leader in that first century culture would do, he starts a conversation with them first about whether his mission is only to the descendants of Israel or whether they should also be open to helping foreigners and outsiders, like this Canaanite. And he asks the woman, too, "What's your opinion about all this?" Though he does so in a way that is really kind of uncharacteristic and almost unimaginably harsh. We are left to guess, was there some prelude conversation with the disciples? And most scholars think there probably was. Canaanites were regarded as unclean by Orthodox Jews of the time, and that they might have put this word, we know that Canaanites are kind of the dirty dogs of the community. That's that would have been a common way that Orthodox Jews might have referred to them back then. And Jesus has a conversation with them where this might have been brought up, and then says, "I was sent to the woman, to the lost sheep of Israel. My disciples remind me that in our tradition, I'm prohibited from doing anything to help you or your daughter. And then, it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." Now that's the word that Jesus used there, and it's the word that, as I mentioned, many Jews of that time would use to describe the Canaanites. It's harsh enough that I cringe when I read it, and I think it would have been enough to have left that woman run over, and she would have just gone away from him rather than to take the abuse. But notice that's not what happens here. She summons her courage and actually her wit and kind of squares up in front of Jesus and says, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's plate." And in that response, I mean, you get a sense of the toughness behind it right away, but it's even more wonderful, this response, when you know a little bit about the original Greek in which this was written. You know, there are a lot of passages where you can read it over into Greek and it doesn't really add anything, but this is one of those passages where in the Greek, this woman's response gets real interesting, and it's really bold, and it's even, there's a little playfulness in it, much more so than in the English reading. And let me just tell you how it unfolds real quickly. I don't want to get into a big word study, but this part's really worth knowing. In verse 25 in Matthew 15, when Jesus is picking up on the hostility of the disciples, they send her away. And when he says, "It's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs," the word he uses for dog is a derivation of the Greek word kuon, which is the term most Jews used for dogs. Jews in the first century were not keen on dogs. You know, you think about the Jewish culture, they were very keen on cleanliness laws, they were keen on food cleanliness and keeping kosher, all of those kinds of things. And if you're a dog owner, and I'm a dog owner, you will know dogs are not big on cleanliness. Dogs sniff where they shouldn't sniff. They drink out of the toilet. They eat things they shouldn't eat. Dogs do lots of gross things. And so there was a sense for most practicing Jews who cared about culture. Dogs are dirty dogs, dirty dogs. And the word for that is kuon, That's the word. So Jesus begins by saying to that woman, using the common language for dog, "It is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the kuon, the dirty dogs." But the woman's response is very clever because she changes up the frame of reference. And the word that she says back, the word she uses for dogs, as if it is not right to take even the dogs eat crumbs, the word she uses is not kuon, dirty dog. She uses the word kunaria. And that is the word that the Canaanites use for dogs. Canaanites love dogs. I'm of Canaanite lineage. So they love dogs. And they loved to play with dogs, and they didn't care about the dog's uncleanliness, or they looked beyond it. It was no big deal what dogs did. They loved having dogs around despite their uncleanness and despite their imperfection. The word for playful pup is kunaria. And she changes up the frame of reference from saying, "Yeah, you think of dogs like being unclean, but in my culture." In fact, you know, there is to this very day, there is a Canaanite dog. It's can you show a Canaanite dog up there? I found one online. These are Canaanite dogs. The American Kennel Club, to this very day, recognizes these dogs, Canaanite dogs, as a recognized breed. They go all the way back to this ancient time where the Canaanites, rather than thinking of dogs as dirty dogs, thought of them as playful creatures. Yeah, they're kind of dirty. They're certainly imperfect. They sniff where they shouldn't sniff. They drink out of the toilet. But we like having them around anyway. Even the kunaria, even the playful pups, get the crumbs that fall from the master's table. It's, in a way, I don't think it's an overstatement to say, here's a woman that's bold enough to say, even to Jesus, certainly to the disciples and even to Jesus, can't you see it from my frame of reference? They're not so bad. I'm not so bad. And lo and behold, that's why you get this great response. You can almost, as you read along, you almost see the smile come over his face. "Woman, great is your faith." He likes that. Let it be for you. Let it be for you as you wish. And immediately, the text says, her daughter was healed. I mean, it's a beautiful story in a lot of ways, and the obvious implication, I would suggest to you, is that this woman, behind her boldness in asking the question or challenging the frame of reference, Jesus picked up on the trust. She trusted that Jesus' compassion would be enough that she could be herself. She could be honest about what her culture had taught her, how she saw things, which was different from the way disciples saw things, especially when it came to dogs. And she trusted that she would be received as she would, and that her life could be different. She didn't have to be different from who she was to receive that grace of God. And for her, it became the catalyst for great things to happen in her life. And I would submit to you that this is a story that's probably more about spirituality than it is about healing. I mean, a person does get healed in it, I don't deny that, but I think it's actually also a spiritual story in this message. It conveys, I think, pretty clearly that being a spiritual person in the healthiest sense is to cultivate in ourselves this same trust that God's love is unshakable for us, and allowing that trust then to be the source of energy and creativity in how we walk with God into the future. I mean, I think that's kind of the wonderful thing. Here's this woman who said, yeah, some may think of me as a dog, but I certainly think of myself, despite my flaws and my uncleanness. I know what it is to have somebody that I love despite their flaws, and I trust that God will love me in just that way. And Jesus demonstrated that he absolutely did. You know, the heart of God embraces people whose honest questioning and whose sometimes doubts or challenges, they're given honestly. And Jesus never do you notice this? Jesus never leads by trying to scare people. He never tries to scare people from being who they are. There's a teacher down at SMU, Perkins School of Theology, his name is Frederick Schmidt, who teaches spirituality. He wrote a piece not long ago, it was published in the Christian Century, with the title, Real Leaders Do Not Rely on Fear. And that's what he believes. He says, real leaders never motivate people with fear, period. Not for any reason. And that's not just because fear sets distance between the leader and the people he or she is trying to lead. Real leaders don't use fear because it has all kinds of devastating consequences for the leadership task itself, according to Fred Schmidt. Here's some of the fear. Schmidt believes, for instance, automatically starts causing people to withdraw and turn inward. It makes people less creative. It stifles the ability to imagine new solutions, new partnership. Fear does just the opposite. It drives people into themselves and into fixed positions. He says fear also makes it impossible for people to discuss a problem rationally and to draw widely on a variety of viewpoints for a solution. Instead, fear generates suspicion of anybody who's not already on the same team as you, and it undermines the sense that somebody different might help you see things in a way that you've never seen them before. Schmidt says fear also tends to come with a scarcity mentality. It promotes the idea, every man for himself kind of idea, which leads to mistrust and cynicism and erodes confidence in whoever's trying to do the leading. Schmidt says, notice how Jesus never led by fear, but instead shows this kind of consistent divine fondness for people who are spiritually unsettled and asking questions in their lives. And he loved those people into life, not in spite of their doubts. And you see it over and over again in the Gospels, and it feels in our own lives, if we're honest about it, how we can come to God as we are and trust that we'll be received. I was thinking about how to end this sermon, and I was reminded of a hymn from the old Methodist hymnal. I mean, I know that our hymnal the new Methodist hymnal is 30 years old, but I'm talking about the one before that. It's sad when you get old enough that your hymns that you most love are all in the old hymnals, and that have been either going out of print or are out of print. But this particular hymn is by John Greenleaf Whittier. John Greenleaf Whittier is, a famous poet, 19th century, and they say in modern preaching that you're not supposed to read poems anymore, but I mean, if I don't read John Greenleaf Whittier to you, who's going to do it this week? Somebody needs to. And the hymn that I like so much, it's called I Know Not What the Future Hath. And it's about being faithful in the midst of our doubts and questions and in the midst of mystery. John Greenleaf Whittier, I know not what the future hath. I'll leave you with this. I don't know how to do any better than offer his wisdom to you to close. I know not what the future hath of marvel or surprise. assured alone that life and death, God's mercy, underlies. And thou, O Lord, by whom are seen thy creatures as they be, forgive me if I too close I lean my human heart on thee. I know not where his islands lift their fronded palms in air. I only know I cannot drift beyond God's love and care. Amen.